name's Suzanne and I'm one of the tutors here at York College, and today I'm going to show you how to make sweet pastry. Now this is something that we would have done with you during one of the taster sessions, but unfortunately due to the COVID pandemic we're unable to have you here in college. So I'm going to show you how to make a batch of sweet pastry today and how to line a flan tin, and you might then want to go and try it at home. Okay, so I've got in my bowl just here some plain flour, so I've got 200 grams of plain flour and 125 grams of butter. Now I'm just going to break this butter down with my fingers and just rub the butter in. And the beauty of using the butter in here is that you get a nice flavour. So you can use a margarine instead of the butter, but the butter does give a superior flavour. So with this pastry you can make a variety of dishes. So you can make fruit pies, you can make different tarts such as a lemon meringue pie or a chocolate tart or a bakewell tart, and it lends itself nicely for, like I say, a variety of different products. So I've just broken that butter into the flour there, and so it is just like rough breadcrumbs. Now to that I'm going to add 50 grams of caster sugar with 1 egg. I've got my egg in with my sugar. I'm just going to mix it round. That way the sugar dissolves nicely in with the egg, but also the sugar helps to break down the egg white. Okay, and this is the only moisture, so there's no other liquid going into this paste. Okay, it is just the egg and the sugar. The egg adds extra protein and flavour, and the sugar sweetens the pastry up. I'm just mixing it around there nicely just with my fingers until it starts to form a nice dough. Once I've made this paste, I will then wrap it in cling film and I will put it into the fridge, and I'll refrigerate it for 20 minutes before using it. If you do try this at home, you will find that the pastry is quite soft. So don't be worried that you've made a too soft a paste. Just mix it quite lightly until it forms a paste, and it will come together quite nicely. And once it's been refrigerated, you'll see a big difference in the pastry and you'll be able to handle it a lot better. So I'm just going to get that excess paste off my fingers just there, and then just going to lightly roll that into a ball rather, and then wrap it into some cling film, and then I will refrigerate that. Right, so here's my pastry. I've had it in the fridge for 20 minutes, so I can nicely just unwrap it. Now if you leave it in there longer, that's absolutely fine, but you just need to lift it out of the fridge so that you can work with it. Otherwise it might be a little hard to work with. Likewise as well, if you've made pastry and you have any left, you can always freeze it. So if you haven't got time to do the whole dish all in one go, you can always make your pastry and freeze it and then go back to it and use it on another occasion. So I've just got a light dusting of flour just on my workbench there, and also I am just going to flour my rolling pin. And I'm going to lightly roll out my pastry so that I can line my flan tin. Okay, so rolling out my pastry, just backwards and forwards, nice easy movements, and then I'm going to move my pastry just by 1/4 of a turn each time. And again, rather than putting lots of flour on top of my pastry, which will dry the pastry out, I will just keep flouring my rolling pin. And again, just rolling it out backwards and forwards until I achieve the required thickness. Just going to make sure that my pastry is free flowing on my workbench, and again, just backwards and forwards, nice easy movements. And again, just by 1/4 of a turn each time, I am just rolling it out. And then that thickness, I've got a nice thickness, approximately the thickness of a pound coin, okay, that's all the way throughout. Now I've got my loose bottomed flan tin there, fluted edge, and I've previously just greased it. So I've just got some melted butter and I've brushed all the way through around the edges and at the bottom of the pastry there. And I'm just going to very carefully now, with both hands, just lift my pastry up over onto my flan tin, and then I'm going to ease the edges into the flan tin, just carefully lifting up the pastry so it's going into the flan tin all the way down. So making sure that I've got no air bubbles in there. I'm going to use the crook of my finger, and I'm just going to lift my pastry up, just going into the corner of the flan tin all the way around. And then, because I've got a nice fluted tin and I want that flute pattern on my pastry, I'm just going to use the edge of my thumb just to slightly push the pastry into the fluting of the sides of the tin. So when it is then baked, you'll see a nice fluted pattern on the outside of the tin. Now, once I get to that stage, I've got two things that I can do. I can leave the pastry overlapping. So if I was going to be baking this blind, I can leave the pastry overlapping, and then when it is baked, I can then trim off the excess pastry. Okay? I'll explain and I'll show you that bit, and then I'll show you how to trim it as well so it's separate. So to bake it blind, if I was going to bake it blind and then use it, for example, a chocolate tart, I would bake the pastry blind so that the pastry is not going to rise up and cause air bubbles underneath. I'm going to dock it, what we call docking, just pricking it with a fork. So prick all the base of the pastry just with a fork all the way over, so I've got some nice little fork imprints, just little holes in the bottom of the pastry. Now don't be worried if you're then going to be putting a filling in this, because as it's baking, when it's baking blind, these holes close up on themselves. So I'm going to take a piece of silicone paper, so greaseproof paper or parchment paper, whichever you've got, just going to put it into the pastry, and I'm just going to push it all the way in there. So I've got a nice lining inside the pastry there. And then I'm going to use some baking beans and baking peas. Now what we use here, these are just dried peas that have just gone through the oven, dried them out further, and then we can put them in there. Now you may have different baking beans at home, you might have some ceramic baking beans, or you can even use rice, so raw uncooked rice, just to fill the pastry case in to stop that pastry rising up and causing an air bubble. Okay, so that is all ready to go into the oven. Before I put it in the oven, I would let it rest in the fridge for 10 minutes, allow it to rest so it's less likely to shrink when it goes into the oven. Then I would then bake it. So imagine if we had this in the oven and this would now be baked. It isn't, because I'm going to show you how to do the trimming, but imagine if it was baked, we would then just carefully lift out the baking beans. Get rid of those two. And then we would then trim off. So if this had been baking with the baking beans in, prior to filling it with any other filling, I would brush out the base of this with some egg wash and return it to the oven for an extra 5 minutes, and that would help to just seal the holes that I've pricked into the bottom, and then it would be ready for our filling. And then, like I said previously, once it's been baked, again I would trim off all the edges. I did say there was an alternative way of lining the flan tin, and that would be to actually trim off the edges straight away. So if you was making something like a bakewell tart, for example, I would put my pastry in there raw, okay, and then I would just use the back of the knife, okay, just to very carefully take off the edge of that pastry. So all the way around, just very carefully taking it off. So the reason I use the back of the knife and not the sharp edge of the knife is if you use the front sharp edge of the knife, you do risk blunting the knife. So once I've then trimmed off my edge of my pastry, I've got a nice flat edge all the way around. If I was making bakewell tart with this prepared pastry case, I would be putting some raspberry jam into the bottom there, and then some frangipan filling in, and then I would bake it into the oven until it was nice and golden.